Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's quite remarkable to see such a sea of faces in a place that I've never been. It's actually been quite overwhelming for me. I didn't really realize that till this morning, to be here, because this is actually the first time that I've been in a country that was behind the Iron Curtain. And that had more of an effect on me than I really realized. You know, I studied totalitarianism for a very long time. It's been 4 decades. And it's one thing to consider it in the abstract, no matter how deeply and for how long. But it's another thing to come somewhere where it's so close and tangible, and that where the effects are still evident. I was walked through 2 of your main city squares yesterday, including the square that was set up under Tito with the huge sentinel-like buildings overlooking the cold cement expanse with the brutal metallic sculpture off to the one side with shadowy and faceless individuals embedded in the metal like an iron dagger thrust into the ground. And it's not for nothing they called that style of architectural brutalism. It was the perfect aesthetic for a very terrible ideology. So, well, let me tell you what I've been thinking about for all these years, in as brief a period of time as I possibly can manage, and we'll see how much that has utility for everybody in the hall. When I started to study totalitarianism, both on the left and on the right, I was first interested in it, mostly interested in what had happened in Nazi Germany, I guess, and in places like Auschwitz. And even when I was a young person, I was curious about, I would say, the psychological element to that, which was how it was that it was possible, not so much for a social system to go so badly sideways, but for people to go so low, to fall so deep into whatever they fell into, that they were willing to do atrocious things in the service of their group ideology. And I studied that for quite a long time from a political and economic perspective, because when I was a student, and I would say even now, the fundamental hypothesis that's used to explain such things is generally put forth on the sociological level of analysis. But that never struck me as particularly compelling, because I was interested more in what it would be like to be there as a person, as an individual, and how it was that people could bring themselves to turn a blind eye or to participate in the terrible things that happened in so many places over the course of the 20th century. And so that led me deep into an analysis of the understructure of what orients us in the world, I guess. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think once you understand a certain set of fundamental realities about the nature of human existence, then a number of pathways forward start to emerge out of the mist, and those pathways lead to very different endpoints. I looked for a long time for something that I couldn't doubt, and I found some of that as a consequence of reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You know, Solzhenitsyn, who wrote The Gulag Archipelago, which was the book that I would say, at least in principle, demolished the intellectual and moral credibility of Marxism, although perhaps not for as long as we might have hoped. he thought that the Nuremberg trials were the most important event of the 20th century. And it wasn't like Solzhenitsyn was naive. I mean, he knew perfectly well that there was some element in a post-war trial of the victors having the victory over the vanquished. But he believed, given that he wasn't cynical to the core, that something else was being established at the same time. And what was being established was the fact that there were some acts that were so heinous and so atrocious that they weren't excusable under any moral frame of reference whatsoever. And those are the acts that have come to be defined, let's say, as crimes against humanity. And there was an appeal there to a universal human ethic that transcended the specifics of culture. And it was a dagger in the heart of moral relativism. And I think the reason that it was that was because the Nuremberg trials established the principle that there were some acts that were wrong no matter what your culture and no matter what your orders. And that established, in some sense, not so much an absolute good, but at least an absolute evil. And there's some real utility to establishing an absolute evil, because once you accept the idea that that concept is valid, then you sketch out an absolute good in the same way that an artist sketches out negative space. Because if there is an absolute evil that you could participate in or that could take you over, then there's also its opposite. And so, to some degree, the Nuremberg trials and their consequences laid out a very stark moral choice for people. One was to justify the catastrophes of Auschwitz, let's say, by assuming that if you were enculturated in such a manner as to undertake those actions, then that was in some sense forgivable, because all moral systems are nothing but a consequence of a sociological agreement and have no fundamental metaphysical underpinnings. Or alternatively to say, no, all excuses aside, there are acts that are fundamentally wrong and that everyone knows them in their heart of hearts. And that's a very stark choice, that choice. And it was Solzhenitsyn's conclusion that the Nuremberg judgments were correct. And it certainly struck me that from reading Solzhenitsyn and from reading people like Viktor Frankl as well, who wrote a great book called Man's Search for Meaning, that there was some ineradicable element of individual culpability at the core of what allowed totalitarian systems to flourish. And that made me think very deeply about the role of the individual. And so then I looked for other truths, I suppose, that were indisputable. Solzhenitsyn's truth derived from the Nuremberg trials was that there was that evil existed in an undeniable manner. And that's really something to come to terms with. It's a strange thing for an academic to even consider, because it's certainly been my experience in the academy that there's a cynicism about discussions of good and evil, that those are no longer categories that are appropriate ways to conceptualize the world for sophisticated people. That you look for sociological explanations, and that's mode of conceptualization is somehow an archaic hangover from our religious and superstitious past. But the problem with that is that it doesn't help us grapple with the sorts of things that happened in Auschwitz or behind the Iron Curtain in the Gulag Archipelago, or in Maoist China with the millions of deaths that are clearly attributable to the pathological actions of both state and individual. And so I left that literature, which is a very dark literature, with an unshakable belief that certain actions were wrong, and also with some recognition that as a consequence, some actions were right. And whatever those actions that are right are is whatever takes you farthest away from those things that are the most dreadful. And so you could say, well, it's very difficult to determine what might constitute heaven and what might even constitute a trajectory that's heavenward. But one thing you know for sure is that it's away from hell. And that's really something to know. I thought more about the human situation. I was also curious when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning. It was during the raging of the Cold War. I wrote most of it in the 1980s and 1990s. And I was also interested in something else that was fundamental, but it was associated with the idea of moral relativism. You know, the world had locked itself into this armed combat that ran from 1945 to 1989, but is still continuing in some sense, and of course started even before World War II, based on two different views of the world, whatever the view of the communist bloc was, and that's a collectivist view, let's say, and whatever the view that the West held, which is, you could say an individualist view, but that's not exactly accurate. We'll return to that. It's not so much individualist, I guess we'll return to it right now. It's not so much individualist as it's predicated on the idea that the fundamental conceptual level that history and humanity should be construed at has the individual at its center. And then I was curious, and I guess this was a postmodern idea, although I didn't know it at the time. I was curious about whether these were just two arbitrary systems. You know, you could imagine there's many games that people can play locally and collectively, and the relativist stance is that, well, there's a plethora of those games and there's no real way of rank ordering them morally. It's all the same in the end. And that's a reasonable claim, or at least it's a reasonable question. I don't think it's a reasonable claim, actually, but it's a reasonable question. Is there something that makes one system, in some sense, fundamentally preferable to another, fundamentally correct? Or is it a matter of arbitrary social organization as a consequence of the acceptance of some equally arbitrary initial axioms? And I think that when I was studying the Soviet Union, that I was agnostic about that. I felt that what we had accomplished in the West was admirable and worthy of protection and support, but it wasn't obvious to me if it was correct, what correct would mean, or why it was correct. And so that was another problem that I was trying to solve, is that, is this merely a matter of opinion played out in this ongoing struggle, a struggle that was intense enough to demolish many millions of people, but also for all of us to risk putting everything to the torch, because that's what we were risking during the Cold War, and what we still risk to some degree today, although I would say the danger of that has decreased, at least to some degree. So if it was merely a matter of opinion, then it was certainly one that we were taking very seriously. And so then I did something intellectually that I realized later was roughly analogous to Descartes' search. He was motivated by doubt. He wanted to find something axiomatic that he could not, in which he could manifest faith that could not be shaken. And for Descartes, it was I think, therefore I am, which I think is more something like I am conscious. I know I'm conscious, or I'm immediately aware of my own consciousness, and I can't dispute that. And I knew of Descartes' conclusion, but it wasn't the proper one for me. What I came to understand for me was that the most undeniable reality was pain. And I think that that's in keeping, and I learned that since, with the great religious traditions who insist, the Buddhists insist, for example, that life is suffering. And Judaism, of course, is rife with stories of endless historical catastrophe, and Christianity puts suffering at the middle of its conceptual system as a fundamental reality. And I believe it is a fundamental reality. And I do believe it is, in some sense, the fundamental reality. Now, it's not the only fundamental reality. And there may be truths that transcend the fact that life is suffering. But it's not a bad place to start. And I believe that it's not a bad place to start because I don't think it's deniable by anyone. First of all, even people who are morally relativistic and nihilistic have a very difficult time disputing the reality of their own pain. It's not amenable to rational eradication. You can argue yourself out of any positive meaning in life. You can say, well, what difference does it make in 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years? You can say, I'm only one person among 7 billion. What possible difference could I make? You could say, well, we all exist on a little dust speck of a planet out in the God-forsaken suburbs of an infinite universe. And all of that bespeaks of an exceptionally cold and impersonal fundamental reality. But none of that's very useful to you if you're actually suffering. And so there's an inalienable reality to pain that constitutes a meaning in life that rational discourse has no effect upon. And that's useful. And so then it struck me that there were two fundamental realities that we might all have to contend with, and one would be suffering, and the other would be malevolence of the sort that Solzhenitsyn outlined as eternal in some sense and unacceptable and manifest in such catastrophes as the Nazi Holocaust in the 30s and the 40s. Suffering and malevolence, definitional conditions of the world. And then I started to read psychology broadly, and I found people like Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung who were very interested in fundamental stories. The psychoanalysts early on started to understand that our cognitive structures are actually organized as personalities. We're collections of sub-personalities. And those personalities manifest themselves when they're represented in stories. And so we think in stories, and even more importantly, even when we don't think in stories, so let's say when we're thinking scientifically, all that articulated objective knowledge is still embedded in an underlying narrative structure. And that was a psychoanalytic claim, but when I started to study neuropsychology and brain function, the stories converged, because it also appeared to be the case that if you look at a function biologically, that the claim that we see the world as a story seems to be both objectively and metaphorically true. And that made me very interested in the structure of stories. And I started to realize, I think, that the deeper you went into a story, the closer you got to the fundamental story, and the closer you got to the fundamental story, the more you started to touch on the domain that's been eternally religious. Because I think that is what the religious domain is it's an outline of what's most fundamental about the stories that we all inhabit. I've noticed this too in my clinical practice, because I've dealt with people who've been in very, very dire straits, sometimes because tragedy has befallen them, and then more frequently because more serious, because tragedy and malevolence have befallen them. Not only has something terrible happened to them, but it was as a consequence of their own moral misstep, which is a terrible situation to be in. It's terrible to have something tragic happen to you, but it's much worse to have it happen to you because of something that you did that you didn't have to do and that you're now culpable for. That's devastating for people. Or to fall prey to the same catastrophe because of the malevolence of others. And whenever I talk to people who are in that situation, who'd been targets of their own malevolence or someone else's and have been brought low because of it, no dialogue that didn't involve religious conceptualizations came even close to dealing with the importance of the issues. And I saw that clinically, and I've also talked to many soldiers who've come to my lectures, who've watched. I have one lecture in particular on the distinction between tragedy and evil, which is a very elaborated lecture on the structure of malevolence. And many of the soldiers who talked to me who had post-traumatic stress disorder told me that they started to recover from what had happened to them once they watched that lecture. And there's a few like that, but because you need a vocabulary, a lexicon of morality, you need a lexicon of good and evil in order to deal with the fact of malevolence, whether it's yours or someone else's. And without that lexicon, then you're naive target of forces that are dark beyond your ability, not only to understand, but even to tolerate. And I mean that most seriously, because people who have post-traumatic stress disorder are actually damaged physically as a consequence. Right? It produces quite profound alterations in brain function and structure, some of which are irreversible. They're not all irreversible, but some of them are. And so that's real. So then I was curious, well, if the fundamental realities of life, the fundamental reality of life, or the undeniable substructure of life, something like that, is an intermingling of suffering and malevolence, what does that mean? Well, the suffering part, that seems to stem from the structure of existence, I suppose. We're limited creatures, finite, fragile in some sense, and we know it. And I found that outlined very interestingly in the Old Testament stories, in Genesis, especially in the story of Adam and Eve, which as far as I can tell is a condensed representation of the dawn of self-consciousness for humanity. I can tell you a bit about that quickly because I think it's so fascinating and because it took me a couple of decades to untangle. You know, Adam and Eve are portrayed in the Garden of Eden as unself-conscious, and they are forbidden to transform themselves in one particular way. They're not supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're warned against it, but they do because they're curious, which of course is one thing you can say about human beings, is that we're interminably curious, and that if you ever forbade us from doing anything, then that would be the first thing that we would be inclined to go and try and do. And so that's very realistic psychologically. Eve eats the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the scales fall from her eyes. That's a very interesting formulation because it means that, well, she can see now what she could not see before, which seems like an improvement, you know. You think an enhancement of vision, that's an improvement. And it is, of course, the truth that God forbids human beings to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because they might become as gods. And so there is some strange ambivalence in that story about God's motivation in relationship to people and his desire, let's say, to keep them blind, at least to certain realities. And as soon as Eve eats and the scales fall from her eyes and she shares the fruit with Adam and the same process occurs to him, they realize that they're naked. That took me a long time to understand because I wasn't sure what it meant in that context. But to be naked, especially if you're human, is to expose yourself to the world first. I mean, we're all clothed, and we're clothed to protect ourselves from the elements, obviously, and to stay warm or to stay protected. But we're also clothed to shield ourselves from the gaze of others and to keep our private shame at our own vulnerability off the table, hidden. And that's a human universal, that proclivity to be clothed. And that realization of nakedness, I saw that occur mostly in my son when he was about somewhere between 2 and 3. You know, at one point, he just became private. He was in the bathroom alone. He didn't want people to watch him being dressed. He became very private and aware of his own what? His own nakedness. Well, when people discover their nakedness, they discover that they're going to die. That's when death enters the world. And so that's the other element of discovering your own nakedness, your own fragility, is that human beings are self-conscious in this very particular way that makes us aware of our own fragility, but also aware of our finitude, of our mortality, and that's the burden that we have as human beings that isn't shared by any other creature. And the interesting thing about the biblical metaphysic is that that's portrayed as a cataclysmic schism in the structure of reality itself. And I believe that's something that we should take very seriously because human beings are very complicated creatures. We are the most complicated things that exist by a huge margin. And we're the most complicated things that exist that have become self-conscious. And God only knows what that means for the structure of reality itself. It means nothing if you conceptualize us, as I said before, as meaningless creatures on a meaningless planet spinning around an equally meaningless sun. But if you attribute something central to the existence of consciousness itself, then a transformation in consciousness of that magnitude might well be something of cosmic significance. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at things because I think consciousness is something of cosmic significance because it seems to me that the existence of things depends in some manner that we do not understand on the conscious observer. And it's not obvious that there are any conscious observers, or at least any self-conscious observers, except us. And so, whatever that role is, it's certainly central in some important manner if existence itself is of import. And so, Adam and Eve become aware of their own fragility and then they clothe themselves immediately. And it's partly because they're ashamed, but the reason they're ashamed is because they understand that they're vulnerable, which is the same reason that we're all ashamed. I mean, and it's certainly the case that shame is a universal human emotion. We feel that in relationship to ourselves because we're not all we could be, but we certainly feel it in relationship to others and the judgment they pass on us. And so that's an existential fact for humanity. And so to cover yourself up is to protect yourself from that and to protect yourself as well from the fact that since you're fragile and since you're mortal, that things conspire to destroy you not only now, perhaps when you're feeling safe, but at some point in the future where that safety disappears, because now we can consider ourselves across an expanse of time and see our vulnerability across our entire lifespan, and as a consequence, never truly be free of it, because even if you have nothing to worry about right now, which might be a situation in which an animal would not be worried, there's plenty to worry about tomorrow, and if that's fine, well, then you can always worry about next month or next year, or maybe you can worry about your family. It doesn't matter. There's plenty of vulnerability to go around. And so then that's permanent. That's a permanent descent, let's say, into a kind of existential angst. And I think that's equivalent to the entry of death into the world from a metaphysical perspective. And then the other strange thing that happens that's insisted upon in that story is that the discovery of nakedness is also simultaneously the discovery of good and evil. And that's part of the knowledge of gods, is the knowledge of good and evil. And I couldn't figure that out for the longest time. I thought, what in the world is the association between having our eyes open to our own finitude and knowledge of good and evil? And then I thought, it took me 20 years to figure this out. I thought, oh, I understand. Once you understand your own capacity for suffering, your own vulnerability to suffering, once you understand that and can model it, once you know that you can be hurt and you know how you can be hurt, then you know how other people can be hurt. And then you can use that as a weapon. And I do believe that it is the case that human beings are the only creatures that can do that. We can use our knowledge of our own fragility as the core insight that allows us to torment ourselves and others. And that means that we're no longer innocent predators like wolves or lions that bring things down because they have to eat to live, but we've become creatures that can use agony as an aesthetic. As an aesthetic, that's the right way of putting it. And we can draw out catastrophe and suffering to as creative a degree as we can possibly manage. And that does put us instantly into a moral universe. So the idea that the individual is a moral agent, that struck me as solid in the face of suffering and malevolence. The individual is also a moral agent. And so that's one stroke on the side of the conceptual scheme that puts the individual at the center of things. And then I started to understand stories that were earlier even in the same biblical corpus. The idea that there's an idea right at the beginning of Genesis, I lectured about this a lot last year, that there are three elements that are involved in the generation of being. It's not the same idea as the construction of the material world. It's not the same frame of reference. It's a different conceptual scheme. It's one that assumes that consciousness is central to being rather than a secondary epiphenomenon. God is a paternal figure in Genesis, a structure. God the Father is a structure. That's one way of thinking about it. And the story is that whatever this paternal structure is, patriarchal structure, let's say, uses a process, logos, to interact with chaotic potential to generate habitable order. And I think that that's an accurate way of looking at things, is that in order for there to be, there has to be a structure, there has to be a process, and there has to be something upon which that is acting. And in Genesis, that's the tohu vabohu, that's the chaotic potential. And it means without form and void, but it also means potential. And so there's this idea that God as a structure uses the logos, which is something like creative, communicative speech, something like that. It's broader than that. It also means the tendency to explore, and it also means truth. It means all of those things at once. To interact with potential and to generate habitable order. And then there's an insistence in the same story that when that process occurs properly, which means that it's created by the Logos, then the habitable order that is created is good. One of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and also from Viktor Frankl and other observers, Jung as well, Carl Jung believed that psychotherapy was unnecessary if it could be substituted, if a sufficient moral effort could be substituted. So he thought of psychotherapy as a fundamentally moral process and really believed that it was a consequence of truth. And I would say that's true of all the clinical psychologists and psychiatrists that I've studied. In the final analysis, their fundamental claim is that something like a combination of courage and truth is redemptive. It's very interesting because it's a restatement of a very old idea. It's the oldest idea in the West, perhaps, that courage and truth are redemptive. Certainly, if you're in Freudian psychoanalysis, you go into your past and what you haven't yet been able to process because perhaps you've avoided it, that might be repression. I think it's not a bad example of repression, although sometimes you avoid because you cannot understand and sometimes you avoid because you will not understand. But the confrontation with what you found intolerable in the past is curative. And then that's generalized across the psychotherapeutic disciplines because in every psychotherapeutic school, there are certain truths that are intolerable in some sense that you're encouraged to voluntarily confront and to analyze and then to articulate and then to accept and then to adapt to. And so there's definitely a call to courageous, truthful being in the psychotherapeutic process that looks to me like a recapitulation of a much older religious idea. And so that's another good example of the truth that people act as fundamental moral agents. Then there's a more prosaic element, and you can think about this. I think it's worth thinking about, because I think this is how we think of each other. And I think this is how we treat each other. And I think this is what we upbraid ourselves for when we fail. You wake up in the morning, and what is it that confronts you? Now, you could say that it's the material reality of the circumstances around you, and that you're driven like clockwork by that. But that isn't how it appears phenomenologically, I don't believe. I don't see that that's how we see ourselves when we awaken in the morning. What we see in front of us is a field of potential, constrained to a large degree for some of us and wider for others, but still definitely present. And that's the domain of what could be that day. And I think the day is the right level of analysis. And you wake up and you confront the world and you think, well, here's a variety of ways that things could play themselves out today. And that's that field of potential that's in front of you. It could go this way, or it could go this way, or it could go that way. And you know that maybe you have difficult decisions ahead of you. And you know that perhaps you're motivated to avoid some of them, or maybe not to take the difficult decision, but to take the easy way out. And you have some inkling of how things would go if you did it properly, or if you avoided it, or if you took the easy way out. You can understand how the future would be likely to unfold if you took any of those patterns of action. And then you get up and you decide to act or to not act in accordance with your decisions. And as a consequence, you turn the potential that characterizes the future into the actuality of the present and the past. And so to me, what that means is that whatever your consciousness is, which in the oldest sense is the thing that has, what would you say? It's that which dwells within you, that's made in the image of the God who created things at the beginning of time. That's the idea, is that the implementation of that transforms the chaotic potential that confronts you in the form of the indeterminate future into the actual world. And that's what we do. And we do that as a consequence of our moral choices. And in Genesis, the claim is that insofar as God used the Logos to perform exactly the same function, then the habitable order that was created was good. And that's insisted upon repeatedly. And so there's a deep ethic there, and it's a very deep ethical idea. And the idea is that it's possible, you have within your grasp the possibility to take the world despite its suffering and its malevolence and to confront it in a manner that, as a consequence of applying truth, will transform what you produce out of that potential into what is good. And that's a call for a particular form of ethical being. And it's on you. Is that you make decisions to go this way or that way, and some of the decisions lead up to something that's positive, and some of the decisions lead down to something that's negative. And if enough of us make the decision to move down into what's negative, then that's exactly what happens. And we create situations around us that are so close to hell that the distinction is merely semantic. And so you might say, well, you're no believer in heaven, and perhaps you're no believer in God, but you could easily be a believer in the ability of your own cowardly indecision and determination to use deceit instead of confronting things courageously and truthfully to produce something around you that's hell for all intents and purposes. And I think that was the lesson of the 20th century. I think that's exactly what happened. I think that the reason it happened is because individuals abandoned their moral responsibility. And that moral responsibility is, in some sense, absolute enough to be unbearable. Having said that, so then my conclusion, because of all that, and for other reasons as well, was that, well, it was true that life is suffering tainted by malevolence, but that there was a power of spirit that characterized the human being that enabled him or her to confront that forthrightly with nobility of purpose and to transcend the suffering and constrain the malevolence, and that was within our grasp. And that what that meant fundamentally was that despite the undeniable structural reality of finitude and evil, that the spirit of the human being was so powerful in its potential that could be confronted and accepted as a fundamental responsibility, and then transcended and repaired as a consequence. And so that was an inversion of the most pessimistic possible view, I suppose, which is that life is ineradicably suffering and malevolence, into the opposite view, which is that if that is taken on voluntarily, then it's something that can be transcended and rectified. And that's the sacred responsibility of every single person. And worse, that the abdication of that responsibility, which is in some sense virtually unbearable in its weight, that the abandonment of that or the avoidance of it produces a void in the structure of reality that's filled by something that's hellish. And so it's not only that you fail to make things better when you could by stopping doing the things that you know to be wrong, but that if you don't take forthright action, then the space you leave is filled by something that's dreadful. And so the conclusion of all that was that the collectivists were wrong. And those who insisted that the individual was the sovereign foundation of the state, and that each individual has a divine element that's the rationale for that foundational sovereignty and the reason for our equality before God and the law, that's correct. in the most fundamental of ways. And that it wasn't a mere matter of arbitrary argumentation and moral relativism, but a battle between a viewpoint that was fundamentally correct and functional, although overwhelming, and one that was destined to pathological catastrophe right from the onset. And so what I've been attempting to do since then, and I guess that's part of the reason why you're all here, I suppose, is to suggest to individuals that there's far more to you than you would like to believe. And that whether you manifest that in the world properly makes far more difference than you would like to imagine. And the downside of that is the crushing weight of that voluntary adoption of your moral burden. But the upside is the discovery of the nobility that's within you, that's of sufficient force and power to be aligned in some sense with the most fundamental realities of the world, and that constitutes a sufficient wellspring of strength, if drawn upon properly, for you to bear the suffering and malevolence that characterizes the world without becoming corrupted as a consequence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Hvala vam, res ste pozorni poslušalci. Prepričana sem, da se je nabralo tudi nekaj vprašanj. We have time for the Q&A. There might be some interesting questions, so I would like to ask to the stage, torej pridružiti nam bo tisti odgovorni pri založbi Družina, gospod Tone Rode, ki je zbiral tudi, spremljal tudi vaše vprašanja preko aplikacije. Predlagam, da kar prevzamete besedo, Tone.
Hvala lepa vsem. Saj ste vsi spremljali verjetno, ne, v aplikaciji ste videli, kako so se vprašanja dvigala. So I will speak English and start with a couple of questions, try to convey the most important of them. So I would, at the beginning, combine two that are the second and the third one, which go like that. How to talk to people about meaningful things, but to people that do not care about freedom and truth. And there's another one, how to deal with radical left ideology. Probably those two have something in common. I'm just saying.
Well, I would say first that the best way to talk is through example. I mean, first of all, there'll be people that you can't talk to. And you can tell when you're talking to people that you can't talk to because they don't listen. In which case, you're not actually talking to them. You're talking to a set of preconceived notions that they're clinging to desperately that they will not alter under any circumstances. And it's generally the case that ceasing a conversation like that is often your best strategic bet. But having said that, if it's a matter of convincing, then the most convincing action is actually action. I mean, the way to move people towards respect for freedom and responsibility is to manifest your commitment to both of those through action, and to demonstrate that in the confines of your own life, that actually works. And it does work. And so it's a pretty powerful argument. I think the best way to convince people is not so much to challenge what they believe, because that can make them more resistant and rigid, but to show or tell a better story. And it is the case that it's one of the things I learned as a clinical psychologist. I mean, not only that, but that many times in life people don't get what they want and they need because they don't aim at it. And it's a hard lesson for people to learn because they're cynical to begin with and they presume that there's no possible way of moving forward. But it's not so unreasonable to assume that you're not going to hit what you don't aim at, or you're not going to hit what you aim at and don't shoot at. And I've seen time and time again that if people do put forward a vision for what they regard as worthy of pursuit, which is something you have to determine in dialogue with yourself. It's like, given the difficult preconditions of existence, is there anything that you could conceive of that you would regard as sufficiently worthwhile so that you would be motivated to pursue it? It's a profound philosophical question, and it's not an unreasonable one. It's a good place to start. It's like, well, life is difficult enough to make you cynical and bitter, and perhaps enough to make you cynical and bitter and suicidal and homicidal and even genocidal. And it's not surprising in some sense. And then the question is, well, is there something that you can pursue that allows that to be acceptable or perhaps even desirable, which is something to do that justifies the suffering? And it's hard to say what that would be for each of you. It's something that you can discover. This is partly why Nietzsche was wrong. Nietzsche thought that after God had died, that human beings would have to invent their own values. But the psychoanalysts, I would say Jung foremost among them, put forward a very powerful counterclaim, which was that, well, you can't invent values. They're already built into you. You have to discover them. And I think that's true for each person. It's like, well, what would justify you in the abandonment of your resentment and hostility? What would be a sufficiently adventurous goal? And this is part of the problem with the collectivist viewpoint, I believe. I was thinking about that today too. You know, I learned as a psychotherapist not to solve my clients' problems for them. You're a bad therapist if you offer advice. I mean, you do sometimes, because there are situations that are relatively trivial that just need to be strategized through. But fundamentally, what you want to do, if you're careful, as a friend or a family member or as a psychotherapist, is to help the person discover their own pathway forward, right? And that's going to be a difficult pathway, because it means that they're going to have to accept the burden of their life. And then they're going to have to come up with their own solutions to what would justify that burden. And if they come up with their own solutions, then often they find one that at least in part justifies the burden. And the problem with the collectivist perspective, especially the one that portrays you as a victim, is that it's always up to someone else to solve your problems. It's not like you don't have the problems. You know, the idea that in some sense you're an eternal victim, well, there's a truth in that, given that nature is conspiring to destroy you and will be successful in the end, that you're undermined by your own society at the same time you're buttressed by it, and that you're a target of your own malevolence and that of others. I mean, so there's a triad of tragic and malevolent forces that are aimed directly at your heart, and that's always the case. But to not take responsibility for that and to attribute to that to a cosmic injustice or a sociological injustice in some sense that's aimed particularly at you, that's somehow the fault of others, is to miss the great adventure of your life. You know, one of the things I learned last year, I was doing a series of biblical lectures, and I started to analyze the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know very well. And the story of Abraham is particularly interesting because he's a slow starter. He's one of those guys that failed to launch, right? He's in his father's tent hanging around his mother's skirts till he's 80. And 80, that's exactly it. And God finally gets fed up with him and says, look, why don't you get the hell out of the tent? and get out there in the world and have an adventure. You know, your life is waiting for you. And well, it's God calling, so Abraham has enough sense to pack up and leave, but it's complete bloody catastrophe from there on in, you know. I mean, the first thing he encounters is a famine, and that's no joke, and then it's a tyranny, that's the next thing, and then it's a conspiracy to steal his wife. And I'm sure that he spent the next 20 years wondering why in the world he ever listened to God and just didn't stay in his damn tent. You know, but there's, and the Abrahamic story and the stories that follow that, they all have that same narrative structure, is that there's this call to adventure, but it's not to happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's to a heroic mode of being that involves taking responsibility for the full catastrophe. And that in that adoption of that adventurous mode of being, there's a deep meaning to be found. Right? A meaning maybe that transcends just you, that involves your family and that involves your community and maybe even the destiny of humanity itself. But there's nothing about that that's secure or easy, and very little that has to do with happiness. The idea that your problems should be solved for you, let's say, and that it's unfair that you have them, well, it's attractive in that there's nothing for you to do except complain. But it's horrifying in that there's nothing for you to do except complain. The difficulty is actually, the funny thing is the difficulty is actually the destiny. And it is insanely difficult, but maybe you're insanely up to the task. You know, and I would also say, there is evidence for this, you know, in the clinical literature. We know that one of the main strategies that you can use to help people cure themselves is for them to grapple with what they're terrified by. Grapple with what they're terrified so badly that they're avoiding. And to learn to confront it in pieces, in stages, in manageable stages. Not too much, you know, because you can hurt yourself, but not too little, because then it's pointless. And it works. It makes people not less vulnerable, but more courageous and stronger, which is better than being less vulnerable, because good luck with that. That's not happening. But you can be more courageous and you can be stronger. And if you take on the burden of confronting the catastrophe of your existence, then that happens. And it actually works. And that's part of what everyone is called upon to discover in their life, and partly what religious stories try to remind people of, in some sense, to wake them up, say, you're more than you think you are. And this is another thing I realized on this tour, actually. I hadn't conceptualized this properly before. There's this old idea that the hero rescues his father from the abyss, or from the belly of a great monster, the dead father. You see that reflected in stories like Pinocchio in the Disney movie, because the puppet rescues Geppetto from the belly of a whale, the most terrifying possible place at the bottom of the lowest possible abyss. And what that means is this, is that if you stare, and this is the answer to the Nietzschean dilemma. Nietzsche said, beware of staring. If you look long into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. Well, if you look long enough into an abyss, then you discover something at the bottom of it. And what you discover at the bottom of it is your dead father. And what that means is that if you look at what terrifies you forthrightly enough, then you discover the spirit of your ancestors that you could become. And that won't be called out of you without that courageous confrontation. Because nothing is called out of you without it being demanded. It's the same as working out in a gym. You lift heavy weights, not so heavy that they hurt you, but heavy enough so that they're slightly beyond your capacity to grasp. Nothing is compelled out of you without necessity. And so then you ask, well, what if you subject yourself to the highest possible level of necessity? Maybe then the possibility is that the best there is called forth out of you. And that's a union with all the great, that's the union with what's greatest about humanity in the past, because that's in you. But it's not going to come out without compulsion, and the compulsion that you set upon yourself. And so that's the antidote to the collectivist viewpoint. It's like, it's your problem, and thank God for that. Because you need a problem to justify your miserable existence. And it has to be a problem of sufficient magnitude so that you can look yourself in the mirror when you wake up in the morning and you can think, well, despite my inadequacy and all the things about me that are insufficient, at least I'm bearing up under this worthwhile load. And that's a start. So,
thank you. At this rhythm, we are quickly running out of time, but I have to combine two other questions. It's your first time in a post-communist country, and I have two questions. One from Rok Punchuch, who says, Jordan, how should we, as young people, shape the society so that old communist regime will be recognized as bad? Because many still regard it as positive. And there is an anonymous one, also connected to this one. How do you comment nostalgia after communism in ex-communist countries?
So, I'm going to return to a biblical story again. It's a story that I'm going to talk about a lot in September, I hope, when I get to the Exodus story. So, you know, Moses leads his people out of a tyranny. Right? So that's, the relevance of that story is obvious. And then you think, well, you leave a tyranny and then things are better, but that isn't what happens. And this is a very useful thing to know about your life in general. You think, well, people could be enlightened. That's the theory. And so then there's a question. Well, one might be, well, maybe that's just a false theory and that enlightenment is not possible. But we'll leave that aside. We'll assume for the moment that it is possible, but that there is a barrier to it. And you might think, well, what could possibly be the barrier? Because being enlightened is obviously better than not being enlightened. And then the obvious answer would be that there's a serious barrier. And the barrier is that you have to go down before you go up. And you know this already in your life because you'll have your set of preconceptions, whatever they happen to be, and they're semi-functional. And then you lay them out in the world, and now and then you encounter a terrible error, and they collapse. And when they collapse, well, you're no longer constrained by your erroneous presuppositions, but now you're nowhere. And that's even worse. And that's what happens to the Israelites, and that's why they're in the desert for 40 years after the tyranny collapses. Right? And when they're in the desert, well, they turn to all sorts of false idols because, of course, that's what people do when they're trying to replace a tyranny. It's like, well, it might be this, it might be the golden calf, right? It might be that, it might be this. They fragment and they fight. And then they look with nostalgia back onto the past when everything was hypothetically secure and solid. And that's human nature, to look with nostalgia to the past, even if it was a tyranny. You know, and now and then you learn something in your life that's painful, and before you've learned what the pain has to teach you, you could easily be nostalgic for the position you had before the bomb was dropped upon you. And then maybe when you recover, if you do, you look back and you think, well, that was an absolute catastrophe, all of that, but I'm very glad that I had the chance to go through it because I'm now more than I was. But the progress forward is descent into the underworld and then ascent, and not just a linear line upward. And maybe you can mitigate that to some degree by accepting the terrible truth bit by bit when it confronts you, so that you don't have to have a complete catastrophe to learn something. But it's still the case that you learn in pain. And the consequence of that is that you're nostalgic for your ignorance. And that's certainly what's happening in these sorts of situations. That, combined with a certain amount of historical ignorance and a nice additional dollop of malevolence. And I suppose as well the lack of desire to accept responsibility for the alternative. I would say it's a reflection of what I mentioned previously. Put your life together and make something better. That's the way to defeat nostalgia for the false past. And don't be so sure you can't do it. I have this program I'll tell you about very briefly because of the effects it's had that have been surprising to us. because we've tested this empirically. It's called the Future Authoring Program, and it's on a site called selfauthoring.com. And it's a program that is designed to help people make a plan for their life. And it's a fairly straightforward program in some sense, although not so much in others. I might say, well, what do you want to do with your life? And you think, oh my God, I can't answer that question. It's like, that's a big question. And so you don't know. Part of the problem is it's not a very good question. It's not differentiated enough. So if you ask yourself a question that's so large you can't answer it, well, then you should ask yourself a smaller question. And so in this program, you're asked to do things. We tried to make it practical. It's like, okay, it's 3 to 5 years down the road, and you get to have what you need and want within reason, right? Assuming you're taking care of yourself within reason. Well, what might you want? How would you like your family interactions to be going? Siblings, parents? What about your intimate relationship? If you could have what you wanted and needed from that, just what would that look like, hypothetically? Your career or your job, because those aren't the same thing. At least maybe you could have a job that is respectable and that constitutes a valid contribution to those around you and helps justify your position in society. And perhaps you could even have a career, you know, that has some intrinsic meaning independently of that. Your education, your resistance to the temptation of drugs and alcohol and the sorts of things that knock people off the track, your care for yourself mentally and physically, your use of time productively and in an engaging manner outside of work. You could have what you wanted. What would it be? Answer it. Guess if you have to. And then write for 20 minutes about what your life could be like if all of that manifested itself. And then do the reverse. Write about what your life would be like in 3 to 5 years if you let everything about you that isn't good have full sway and take you to your own little subdivision of hell. And people are pretty aware of that. Everyone knows. Everyone I've ever talked to has some real sense of how they would degenerate if they degenerated in their own particular way. Some people would become cruel. Some people would become homicidal. Some people would become alcoholic. Some people would end up on the street. Some people would drift into prostitution. People know where their weaknesses are likely to tempt them and take them. And so then you sketch out a little hell and a little heaven, and maybe you're motivated to run from the one, which is good, and to run toward the other. And so then you have a framework for your life. And then maybe you make a strategic plan. Well, we've done that now with thousands of people in Holland and in Canada, mostly university students, well, all university students in the research studies. And we found at this little college in Canada, Mohawk College, that if you brought students in the summer in their orientation and just had them do this program, which should probably take you about 5 days if you did it thoroughly, if you had them do it really badly in an hour, that decreased the probability that the men would drop out in the first semester by 50%. It was a staggering finding, and we found findings of similar magnitude across the other studies. And the reason I'm telling you this is because a lot of the reason that people don't get what they want is because they don't aim at it. There's this idea in the New Testament, if you knock, the door will open. You think, well, that's an unbelievably naively optimistic statement that no one in their right mind would possibly give any credence to. But the world is a very strange place. And it is the case that your perceptions of the world and the personality that you inhabit orients itself around your fundamental goal. You're goal-directed creatures. You look forward. We point at everything. Like we're arrows that are aimed at, we're either aimed at something or at nothing, but we have to be aimed. And if you aim at something, then the probability that something will come out of that is radically enhanced. And it might not even be what you aim at to begin with, but that's okay, because what do you know? Like, you might be aiming wrong. If you aim and then move forward, your perspective will change, and then maybe you can shift your aim, and that's fine, but at least you're moving forward. Say, well, the way out of the post-communist nostalgia is forward into the future that you want to create. And then the future you want to create is the future that you create. And you might as well create it, because you don't have anything better to do. The other thing that's so important to realize, and this is part of the issue with regards to fragility, is you're all in on this game. You've already staked your life on it. And so you, as far as I can tell, you might as well stake your life on something that you regard as worthwhile. Because you're staking your life anyways. And what's the alternative? You're going to stake your life on something you don't think is worthwhile? It's like, how is that an improvement? There's no improvement in that. And so if you want to plow a better pathway forward, then get out the plow and start working it. And that works way better than it works way better than you would think. I've often wondered, and I think it's a reasonable thing to wonder, it's like, we're not doing too bad in this world, you know, things are a lot better than they were 50 years ago, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, and there's reason to be pessimistic. But you know, it's not like we're all in making things better. We're maybe 60-40 or 65-35 or something like that, each of us individually and then also collectively. You wonder what would happen if we were all in, just how much better we could make things. And there's something that's worth thinking about. There's something to devote yourself to. It's like, how much suffering could you rectify if that was your goal? Your own and other people's as well. And how much malevolence could you constrain? And what amount of good could you do in the world? That's a noble goal, and it's certainly something worth discovering, unless you have something better to do. And it doesn't seem to me that you do. So, well, especially when you think about good, is not as something that's associated with naive adherence to a set of constraining rules, you know, that all good is obedience. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm saying, look, there's problems that are out there in the world, and some of those problems bother you. They're your problems. Right? I don't know why they bother you and some other problems bother someone else, but there are problems that bother you. Those are your problems. Right? That's your call to adventure. Solve them. And see who you are. And show everyone else. Well, and then they won't be nostalgic for the cold, dead hand of the past.
It's nearly time, but there are so many very, very interesting questions. I will let you choose between three for the last one. I mean, we have the top number one. What's your opinion on Slavoj Žižek's, our own philosopher views? And would you debate Slavoj Žižek anytime? And the two, which I find very interesting, but it will probably take a lot of time to answer, but how to save Western civilization without violence and destruction, especially from the dangers such as somebody sees Islam, somebody sees, you know, the communist past or the Nazi-fascist past or whatever. And then there was another very interesting question about the role of men in the 21st century.
Well, with regards to the first question, it would be very interesting, I think, to have a discussion with Žižek. So perhaps if that can be arranged, then that could happen. So. And then maybe the last one, with regards to the role of men in the 21st century. It's like, well, that's part of that call to adventure, you know. I mean, one of the things I love about coming to Europe, I love many things about coming to Europe, but there's a certain magnificence to it that's of unestimable value. I mean, you know, people make pilgrimages from all over the world to Europe, right? I mean, they don't construe them as pilgrimages because they think of themselves as tourists. But you have to ask yourself, well, what are they touring? And what they're touring is what you have produced here that's of absolutely staggering beauty. And it's something that really hits me when I come from North America. I mean, we have great cities. New York City is a great city. Manhattan is a great city. And it's rather jaw-dropping to visit. But Europe has this unbelievable depth of magnificent beauty. And that's a consequence of the great adventuring of all your ancestors. And that's what you can be part of. is precisely that, is this idea that you should have higher self-esteem or that you should be happy. It's like, Jesus, it's so weak. It's so pathetic. It's like, first of all, forget it, because you're not who you should be and you don't deserve your self-esteem. And second, what good is happiness going to do you when you're unhappy? And you will be. So there's nothing in that to get you out of bed in the morning. You need an adventure, and the greater the better. And so it's like it's back to the high seas, gentlemen. You know, out on the rolling waves where there are new continents to conquer and new things to overcome. And if you think that all the frontiers are gone, then you're not looking, because there's frontiers everywhere, and that's where you should be, right? Working diligently to expand the domain of habitable order into the chaos of potential. And that'll force you to discover who you are and to bring that into the world. And that's the role of men in the 21st century. And there's nothing about that that's anything but good for anyone. I mean, one of the things that I detest about the current collectivist ideology and the insistence that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny is that it associates the activity of stalwart men with nothing but tyranny and power. And I think that that's dreadful beyond imagining, because it conflates bravery and courage and competence and the desire to adopt responsibility and the ability to be generous with nothing but power. And it gives men, especially young men, an excuse to be useless so that they'll be harmless, so that they won't be destructive. And none of that's helpful. It's like you're a dangerous creature, and that's a good thing. And you should harness that and discipline it towards some impossible goal, one you can barely lift, and see if you can manage to struggle uphill with it. And then things will straighten themselves out. And then we won't have to ask, well, what's the role of men in the 21st century? There are terrible problems that need to be solved. Solve them. It's within our power to solve them. It's within your power to solve the problems that present themselves to you as your problems. Solve them. That's the right solution. And there's nothing in that that isn't good. And there's nothing in it that isn't like that call to adventure that can get you up in the morning when it's a difficult morning, you know, when things have collapsed around you for one reason or another. You need a purpose for moving forward, and it has to be the sort of purpose that justifies the suffering. So that's that.